Welcome, dear travelers of the night, to another peaceful journey through the mists of ancient time. I am Professor Somnus, and tonight we shall drift together through one of history's most enchanting mysteries. But do not feel compelled to stay awake for every moment. Like the shifting sands of the Egyptian desert, consciousness may ebb and flow, and that is perfectly as it should be, where the boundaries between past and present dissolve like morning mist. Here, in this space between waking and sleeping, we may discover truths that daylight cannot reveal. Allow the weight of modern concerns to slip away, replaced by the timeless rhythm of our shared human story. The lost tomb of Cleopatra, the last pharaoh of Egypt, and feel yourself beginning to float backward through time, past the concerns of today, past the tumult of recent centuries, back to an age when magic and reality were one, when queens could become goddesses, and when the very stones held secrets that still whisper to those who know how to listen. It is the story of a woman who ruled an empire, who spoke with gods, and who chose her own destiny, even in the face of impossible odds. As you settle into your comfortable space, allow your breathing to slow and deepen. Where the ancient city of Alexandria once gleamed like a jewel against the azure waters, the sun is setting, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson, much like the treasures we shall discover together in the darkness ahead. For thousands of years, the mystery of Cleopatra's final resting place has whispered through the corridors of time. Perhaps, perhaps, that mystery is finally ready to reveal itself. But we shall approach it gently, like archaeologists brushing sand from ancient treasures, one grain at a time. Close your eyes, if you wish, and imagine yourself standing at the edge of the Mediterranean Sea. The air is warm and carries the scent of jasmine and frankincense, those sacred perfumes that once filled the chambers of pharaohs. In the distance, you can hear the gentle sound of waves caressing the ancient shore, a rhythm that has remained unchanged since Cleopatra herself walked these very sands. Tonight, we embark on more than just an archaeological exploration. We journey into the realm of dreams and mysteries. The story we shall explore together is one of love and loss, of power and vulnerability, of mortal ambition and eternal rest. As we begin this gentle descent into the ancient world, Chapter 1, The Eternal Queen, let us begin our gentle journey with Cleopatra herself. Cleopatra the Seventh, the final ruler of the Ptolemaic Kingdom of Egypt. She has fascinated people for centuries. This remarkable woman, whose intelligence and political shrewdness became the stuff of legend. Picture, if you will, the young Cleopatra walking through the marble corridors of the great palace at Alexandria. Her footsteps echo softly against the polished stone floors, while shafts of golden sunlight filter through tall windows, casting dancing patterns on the walls, unlocking doors to various cultures and political alliances. She addressed them in flawless Latin. Cleopatra would often retreat to her private chambers, a circular room with windows that looked out over the harbor, where oil lamps cast dancing shadows on walls lined with precious texts. The room contained works in dozens of languages, weaving together Egyptian and Hellenistic cultures with the skill of a master artisan. She embraced the ancient customs of Egypt, neither fully Egyptian nor fully Greek, but something magnificent that transcended both identities. When she appeared as Isis, she wore the traditional headdress of the goddess, speaking of their vision for an empire that would stretch from the Atlantic to the Indian Ocean, with Alexandria as its glittering capital. Together, they dreamed of an empire based not on conquest and oppression, but on the free exchange of ideas and cultures. They imagined cities where Egyptian priests might debate with Greek philosophers, where Roman engineers might collaborate with Babylonian astronomers, where the wisdom of all nations might be gathered and preserved for future generations. They would sit on a terrace overlooking the harbor, watching the last light of day reflect off the white sails of ships from distant lands, while the first stars began to appear in the deepening sky. A solar disk nestled between cows' horns, symbolizing the divine feminine principle that gave life to all creation. Her robes would shimmer with threads of gold and silver, and precious gems would catch the lamplight like captured stars, presenting herself as the reincarnation of the goddess Isis. It was her capacity for deep, transformative love. Her relationships with Julius Caesar and later with Mark Antony were not merely political alliances, though they certainly served that purpose. They were passionate connections that would ultimately reshape the ancient world, while simultaneously maintaining strong connections to her Greek heritage. Caesar and Cleopatra walking together through the royal gardens of Alexandria, their voices low as they discussed not conquests or treaties, but dreams of a future where East and West might exist in harmony. The gardens themselves were marvels of engineering and artistry, with artificial streams that created music as they flowed over carefully placed stones, and exotic plants from every corner of the known world. This cultural blending created something entirely new, a unique and vibrant landscape that reflected her vision of a unified world. Egyptian papyri containing the secrets of the ancient priests, the soft chanting of priests in temple courtyards, their voices rising and falling in rhythms that had been unchanged for millennia. The gentle rustling of linen robes as processions moved through temple complexes, carrying sacred objects that gleamed with gold and precious stones. The sweet smoke of incense rising toward star-filled skies, carrying prayers to gods who had watched over Egypt since the beginning of time. Greek philosophical treatises exploring the nature of reality, Roman histories chronicling the rise of empire, and mathematical works from Babylon that revealed the hidden patterns governing the movement of stars. Here, surrounded by scrolls and manuscripts from the great library of Alexandria, she would study the wisdom of ages past, often quoting their own poets and historians back to them with such eloquence that they found themselves charmed despite their political intentions. This was more than mere linguistic skill. It was a form of diplomatic magic that allowed her to connect with people at the deepest level of their cultural identity. When Egyptian priests came to seek her guidance, she spoke to them in the ancient language of the pharaohs, her words carrying the weight of 3,000 years of tradition. When Greek scholars visited from the museum and library that would later serve her in the complex game of ancient politics, she would spend hours reading the works of historians like Herodotus and Thucydides, learning how previous rulers had navigated the treacherous waters of international diplomacy. She studied the poetry of Sappho and the plays of Sophocles, understanding that the arts could move hearts and minds as effectively as armies. She conversed with them in the language of Homer and Plato. She was also tutored in the practical arts of rulership by the wisest advisors in Egypt. She learned to read the annual flood patterns of the Nile, understanding that the prosperity of her kingdom depended on the river's life-giving waters. She studied the complex rituals of Egyptian religion, mastering ceremonies that connected her to the divine power of the pharaohs, demonstrating her mastery of philosophy and literature, a sprawling complex of buildings and gardens that stretched along the waterfront of Alexandria's harbor. Imagine walls decorated with intricate mosaics depicting the deeds of pharaohs past, their faces looking down with eternal serenity upon their descendant. The air within these chambers was always cool, kept so by ingenious systems of channels that brought Mediterranean breezes deep into the heart of the royal quarters. She moves with purpose, yet there is a grace to her movements, a regal bearing that speaks of centuries of royal bloodline flowing through her veins. The palace itself was a wonder of the ancient world. Cleopatra possessed a gift that would serve her well throughout her tumultuous reign, the gift of language. She was fluent in several tongues: Egyptian, Greek, Latin, and possibly others, including Hebrew, Arabic, and the languages of Nubia and Ethiopia. Imagine her voice, soft yet commanding, switching effortlessly from one language to another as she conversed with diplomats from distant lands. This multilingual ability was like a golden key, but perhaps most remarkably, when Roman senators arrived to negotiate treaties or seek favors, in the quiet hours of evening, when the palace grew still and the Mediterranean breeze carried the scent of jasmine through open windows. Picture this sanctuary of learning. The flickering light of oil lamps would dance across her face as she absorbed knowledge. But Cleopatra's education extended far beyond books and scrolls. Her reign was a remarkable tapestry. Picture the religious ceremonies of her time. Cleopatra would stand at the center of these rituals. But perhaps what made Cleopatra most fascinating was not her political acumen or her legendary beauty. Imagine the quiet moments between these legendary figures, or picture Cleopatra and Mark Antony sharing wine as the sun set over the Nile. These were not merely romantic interludes, but profound partnerships between individuals who shared a vision of what the world might become. There was a section devoted entirely to poetry and literature, where one could find the complete works of Homer, copied on the finest papyrus and illuminated with beautiful illustrations. Her loyal advisor and friend as they walked through galleries lined with statues of famous thinkers. She would stop frequently to examine particular texts, was a complex of palaces and gardens that seemed to float on the very edge of the Mediterranean, with flowering trees from distant lands creating shaded groves where one could escape the heat of the day. There were trees bearing citrus fruits from Persia, date palms from the oases of the deep desert, and flowering shrubs from the mountains of Lebanon that filled the air with their sweet perfume. Their walls decorated with paintings depicting the journey of the soul through the afterlife. Oil lamps would begin to flicker to life in windows throughout the city, their warm glow reflecting off the white marble buildings like stars come down to earth. The air would fill with the scents of roasting meats, fresh bread, and exotic spices. People would gather in small groups, sharing meals and stories as the night deepened around them. These private spaces were furnished with comfortable couches and low tables, creating patterns of moving light that reflected off the dark water, where people from every corner of the world could come together in peace and prosperity. It was a place that embodied her vision of what human civilization could become when guided by wisdom rather than mere force. The sound of sailors calling to each other would mix with the splash of oars and the creaking of rope and wood. where Cleopatra could retreat for meditation or intimate conversations with trusted advisors. Here, artificial channels brought seawater into ornamental pools, where exotic fish swam in schools of silver and gold, their waters dancing in patterns that had been carefully calculated to create music as they fell. Some fountains were designed to represent the annual flood of the Nile, with water flowing in careful stages that mimicked the river's life-giving cycle. Others created abstract patterns that seemed to dance and shift like living beings, the gentle plucking of lyres, the soft notes of flutes, the rhythmic whisper of sistrum bells. Street musicians would gather at crossroads, their melodies blending with the conversations of citizens enjoying the cool evening air. The pools themselves were lined with mosaics depicting scenes from Egyptian mythology, their colors so vivid that they seemed to glow with inner light, her fingers tracing the ancient letters as she absorbed wisdom that had been preserved from ages past. Sometimes she would spend hours in the astronomical section, studying star charts and calendars, understanding that the movements of the heavens influenced events on Earth. The historical section contained chronicles of every known civilization, from the ancient kingdoms of Mesopotamia to the recent conquests of Rome. Cleopatra herself would often visit these halls, moving like a whisper through the corridors of learning. She would consult with the great minds of her age. The city was laid out according to a grid system devised by the architect Dinocrates, with wide boulevards that allowed for easy movement of people and goods. The main street, the Canopic Way, stretched for over 3 miles from the eastern gate to the western gate, lined with columns and decorated with statues of gods and heroes, discussing philosophy with learned Greeks, theology with Egyptian priests, and natural science with scholars from distant Babylon. The library was her sanctuary, a place where she could explore ideas that would later influence her rule. Picture her in animated conversation with Apollodorus. Beyond the library and the lighthouse, Alexandria itself was a marvel of urban planning and architectural beauty. These boulevards were paved with smooth stones that had been carefully fitted together, creating surfaces so level that even heavily loaded carts could move easily. The soft clip-clop of horses' hooves would echo against the marble facades of grand buildings, while the gentle rustle of palm fronds provided a constant, soothing background melody. The royal quarter, where Cleopatra made her home. The gardens themselves were designed as earthly paradises. Fountains sparkled in the sunlight. Hidden grottos provided spaces for quiet contemplation. In the evening hours, when the heat of the day had given way to the cool Mediterranean breeze, the city would take on an almost magical quality. The sound of music would drift from courtyards and terraces. Food vendors would set up stalls along the main boulevards, offering delicacies from every corner of the empire. The harbor itself would become a field of lights as ships prepared for departure on the night tide. Lanterns would swing gently from masts and rigging. This was the Alexandria that Cleopatra knew and loved. A city where dreams took physical form, where the wisdom of ages was preserved and cherished. Chapter 2. Alexandria, City of Dreams. Now, let us drift gently into the world that Cleopatra knew. The magnificent city of Alexandria, that jewel of the Mediterranean that served as the backdrop for her extraordinary life. That legendary conqueror who had dreamed of uniting East and West under a single crown. When Alexander died young, his empire was divided among his generals and Ptolemy. each level decorated with different architectural styles that reflected the cosmopolitan nature of the city, sending signals to ships approaching the harbor or to other lighthouses along the coast. One could hear the gentle lapping of waves against the harbor walls, the soft calls of seabirds wheeling overhead, and the distant sounds of the bustling port. The harbor itself was a marvel of engineering, with artificial breakwaters that created calm waters where ships from every corner of the known world could dock safely. The system was so sophisticated that complex messages could be transmitted across hundreds of miles in a matter of hours, bent over a wax tablet as he worked out the geometric proofs that would bear his name for millennia. The atmosphere was one of quiet contemplation. The medical section housed works by Hippocrates and other great physicians, along with detailed anatomical drawings and descriptions of surgical procedures. The philosophical section contained the complete works of Plato and Aristotle, along with commentaries by later thinkers who had built upon their foundations, where the pursuit of knowledge was considered the highest calling of the human spirit. Scholars would often spend entire days in deep discussion, their voices low and respectful as they debated questions that had puzzled humanity for generations. Or imagine Eratosthenes, the chief librarian, who calculated the circumference of the earth with remarkable accuracy, using nothing more than shadows and simple geometry. Egyptian barges loaded with grain sliding silently through the calm water, Chinese silk that shimmered like captured moonlight, Indian spices that filled the air with intoxicating fragrances, African ivory carved into objects of incredible beauty, rows upon rows of wooden shelves stretched from floor to ceiling, containing hundreds of thousands of scrolls written in dozens of languages. The soft scratching of reed pens on papyrus would fill the air as scribes carefully copied precious texts, ensuring that knowledge would survive for future generations. And amber from the far north that contained the preserved bodies of ancient insects like drops of golden thyme, their sails painted with hieroglyphic symbols invoking the protection of the gods. That legendary repository of human knowledge, where scholars from every corner of the known world came to study and teach. Imagine walking through its quiet corridors, where the air itself seemed heavy with wisdom accumulated over centuries. Greek merchant ships arriving from the islands of the Aegean, their holds filled with olive oil, wine, and precious marble. Roman galleys flying the eagles of the legions, bringing news and orders from the eternal city. At night, a great fire would burn at its summit, fed by cedar wood and frankincense, that gave the flame a sweet, sacred scent that could be detected far out at sea, but rather a vast complex that sprawled across several city blocks. At its heart was the great reading room, a circular chamber topped with a dome that was pierced with carefully placed openings to provide natural light throughout the day. The dome itself was decorated with a map of the heavens, showing the constellations as they appeared in different seasons, so that scholars studying astronomy could always orient themselves to the cosmic patterns above. The base was square and massive, built of local limestone that had been quarried from the nearby hills. The middle section was octagonal, its 8 faces oriented to catch the winds from every direction. The top was circular, housing the great beacon that guided ships to safety. The founder of Cleopatra's dynasty chose Egypt as his kingdom. He understood that Alexandria to a city that represented the very pinnacle of ancient civilization. Alexandria was more than just a city. It was a dream made manifest in marble and gold, a place where the wisdom of the world converged like tributaries flowing into a great river. The city had been founded by Alexander the Great himself. The great lighthouse of Alexandria stood as a beacon, not just for ships navigating the treacherous Mediterranean waters. The lighthouse was built in 3 stages during the day. This mirror would flash messages in brilliant sunlight. Standing at the base of this lighthouse, imagine the scene in Alexandria's harbor on any given morning. From distant lands came ships bearing even more exotic cargoes. But perhaps even more magnificent than the lighthouse was the great library of Alexandria. The library was not a single building. The library's reading rooms were vast halls filled with natural light streaming through cleverly designed windows. Cleopatra understood that earthly events were connected to celestial patterns, and she consulted these instruments regularly when making important decisions. The palace gardens represented another realm entirely, a space where the natural world had been shaped into patterns of almost supernatural beauty. These were not wild spaces, but carefully designed landscapes that told stories and created specific emotional effects in those who walked through them. The main garden was designed as a representation of the Nile Valley in miniature, with artificial streams that flowed in the same pattern as the great river, experiencing the different climates and landscapes of the kingdom without leaving the palace grounds. One section was planted with the papyrus and lotus plants of the delta, setting gems that had been gathered from the far reaches of the known world. Emeralds from Nubia would be combined with pearls from the Red Sea, while diamonds from India would be set alongside sapphires from Ceylon, but centers of artistic innovation where traditional techniques were constantly refined and improved. Master craftsmen would train apprentices in skills that took decades to master, ensuring that the highest standards of artistry would continue for generations to come. Journals where she recorded her thoughts about rulership, philosophy. Cleopatra would often walk through these familiar spaces, perhaps thinking about the weight of responsibility she carried. She was not just a ruler, but the keeper of a civilization that stretched back over 3,000 years. Every decision she made affected not just her own life, but the lives of millions of people who looked to her for guidance and protection, and the challenges facing her kingdom. These private writings reveal a woman of remarkable depth and complexity, someone who understood that her actions would echo through history long after her mortal life had ended. Each piece was not merely decorative, but carried symbolic meaning that reflected Egyptian religious beliefs and royal traditions. Their green fronds creating cool, shaded spaces where the sound of moving water provided a constant, peaceful background. Linen weavers created fabrics so fine they were almost transparent, while dyers used techniques that had been perfected over thousands of years to create colors that seemed to glow with inner light. Contained Cleopatra's personal collection of texts. Letters from Caesar were kept in a special collection, their Latin phrases speaking across the centuries of shared dreams and intimate moments. Documents relating to her relationship with Mark Antony were similarly preserved, creating an archive of one of history's most famous love affairs. Works that she had chosen not just for their scholarly value, but for their personal meaning. Here were love poems in Greek that spoke to her romantic nature, Egyptian religious texts that guided her spiritual development, and philosophical works that helped her think through the complex challenges of rulership. The royal purple, made from murex shells gathered from distant shores, was so expensive that it took the shells from thousands of mollusks to create enough dye for a single garment. Islands in these streams were planted with different types of vegetation, representing the various regions of Egypt, from the delta to the cataracts of Aswan. Bridge walkways allowed visitors to journey through this miniature Egypt. Another section represented the desert regions, with carefully arranged stones and drought-resistant plants that created landscapes of austere beauty, where plants and flowers associated with the goddess created a sacred space for meditation and prayer. Night-blooming flowers would open their petals after sunset, filling the air with perfumes that were said to attract the attention of the divine. Moon gardens reflected silver light during the dark hours, creating ethereal landscapes that seemed to exist in a realm between earth and heaven. Here, the paths were made of sand that had been brought from the actual desert. Goldsmiths worked with metal so pure it seemed to contain captured sunlight, shaping it into jewelry and ceremonial objects that were worthy of the gods themselves. And the plants were those that Bedouin travelers would recognize from their journeys across the vastness. But perhaps the most magical section of the garden was the area dedicated to Isis. The palace also contained workshops where the finest craftsmen of the ancient world created objects of incredible beauty and sophistication. In the jewelry workshops, artisans would spend months creating single pieces. The palace workshops also produced textiles that were legendary throughout the ancient world. These workshops were not merely commercial enterprises. The palace library, though smaller than the Great Library of Alexandria, this personal library also contained correspondence from rulers and scholars throughout the known world. But perhaps the most precious items in this personal collection were works in her own handwriting. In the quiet hours of evening, when the palace grew still and the sounds of the city faded to a gentle murmur. Chapter 3: The Palace of Wonders. Let us now drift deeper into the heart of Cleopatra's world, exploring the magnificent palace complex that served as both her home and the center of her government. Stretching along the waterfront in a series of interconnected buildings and gardens that seemed to flow into the Mediterranean itself. Imagine approaching this wonder from the sea, as visiting dignitaries would have done, watching as the palace complex gradually revealed itself like a vision rising from the waves. It was the way these elements were combined to create spaces that seemed to exist outside the normal bounds of time and space. Rooms flowed into one another through archways that had been calculated to frame specific views, whether of the harbor, the gardens, or the carefully arranged courtyards within. This light was carefully controlled by a system of mirrors and lenses that could be adjusted to create different effects depending on the occasion. It was inlaid with gold hieroglyphs that proclaimed her divine status as the daughter of Isis. The armrests were shaped like sphinxes, their faces combining human intelligence with animal power. The back of the throne rose in the form of a sun disk, with rays extending outward like wings. When the first light of dawn would filter through the eastern windows, these were not merely political documents, but works of art in their own right, an astrolabe that could predict the movements of the planets, a sundial that marked not just the hours but the seasons, and star charts that showed the constellations as they appeared from different latitudes. decorated with illustrations of the peoples and customs of distant regions. She would spend hours studying these maps, imagining the journeys she might take if the demands of rulership ever allowed her such freedom. Illuminating dust motes that danced in the air like tiny spirits, Cleopatra would often rise before the rest of the palace, cherishing these quiet moments when she could think and plan without interruption. During important ceremonies, the light could be focused to illuminate Cleopatra's throne with an almost supernatural radiance. She became more than a mortal ruler. She became the living embodiment of divine authority on earth. The effect was so powerful that even hardened Roman senators, men who had seen the grandeur of imperial Rome, were left speechless by their first sight of the Egyptian queen in her full regalia. This was not merely a residence, but a city within a city. White marble from the quarries of Pentelic, the same stone that had built the Parthenon here. Surrounded by her personal collection of books and artifacts, Cleopatra would spend hours in contemplation and planning. The room was circular, with windows that looked out over the harbor, and walls lined with shelves containing works in every language she could read. A dome decorated with a map of the heavens that was accurate to the smallest detail. Gold stars marked the positions of constellations. It also contained private quarters where Cleopatra could retreat from the demands of rulership and exist simply as a woman of remarkable intelligence and sensitivity. These private chambers were decorated with a more intimate touch, featuring walls painted with scenes from daily life along the Nile, while precious gems indicated the planets as they appeared at the moment of Cleopatra's birth. The effect was that of sitting beneath the actual night sky, but a sky made eternal and perfect, gleamed in the Mediterranean sun. Picture a chamber large enough to hold 1,000 people, its ceiling supported by columns that rose like a forest of stone trees. The walls were decorated with intricate reliefs that told the story of the Ptolemaic dynasty, from the conquest of Alexander through the reign of each successive pharaoh. Columns of red granite from the quarries of Aswan supported porticos that stretched for hundreds of feet, their surfaces polished to mirror-like perfection. A realm where the mortal and divine intersected in ways that still inspire wonder today. The royal palace of Alexandria occupied nearly a quarter of the entire city. The palace buildings were constructed of the finest materials that the ancient world could provide. But it was not merely the materials that made the palace extraordinary. The throne room itself was a marvel of ancient engineering and artistry. The ceiling of this great hall was perhaps its most remarkable feature. At the center of this celestial dome was an opening that allowed natural light to pour into the chamber during the day. The throne itself was a work of art that embodied the entire philosophy of Cleopatra's reign. Carved from a single block of black granite, when Cleopatra sat upon this throne, dressed in her ceremonial robes and wearing the double crown of Upper and Lower Egypt. But the palace was not merely a stage for public ceremonies. Her private study was perhaps the most revealing space in the entire palace complex. Picture this sanctuary in the early morning hours. The room contained not just books, but also maps that showed the extent of her kingdom and the lands beyond. There were also astronomical instruments in this private study. Cleopatra would have been dressed in her finest robes, garments of the purest linen that had been woven by master craftsmen in the palace workshops. The linen itself was so fine it was almost transparent, and it had been treated with oils and perfumes that would preserve it for eternity. The fabric was adorned with gold thread that had been spun from the purest metal, creating patterns that told the story of her reign and her divine nature. Her jewelry was chosen not merely for its beauty, but for its spiritual significance. We can imagine her final moments as filled with the same dignity and intelligence that had characterized her entire reign, their flames dancing gently in the still air. The light would have caught the gold thread in her burial robes, making her appear to glow with supernatural radiance. The walls around her were covered with hieroglyphic inscriptions, with prayers and protective spells designed to safeguard her eternal rest. The location of this final resting place would gradually fade from memory as the Roman occupation of Egypt changed the character of Alexandria, and the old traditions were slowly forgotten. Prayers and spells from the Book of the Dead that would guide her soul, Cleopatra rests in the dignity and splendor that befitted the last pharaoh of Egypt. Her mortal struggles are ended, but her spirit lives on in the mystery that surrounds her tomb and in the dreams of all those who seek to understand the remarkable woman who once ruled the greatest kingdom of the ancient world. Through the challenges of the afterlife and ensure her resurrection in the realm of the gods, she would have been at peace, knowing that she had fought valiantly for her kingdom and her people, and that she was now ready to join the eternal company of pharaohs who had gone before her. Each piece had been blessed by the high priests of various temples, and many contained gems that were believed to have protective powers in the afterlife. The sacred serpent that symbolized her divine authority as pharaoh. Cleopatra might have gazed one final time at the objects that had defined her earthly reign. Scrolls containing the wisdom of ages, jewelry that spoke of the wealth of Egypt, statues of the gods who had watched over her kingdom. But perhaps her thoughts turned not to these material things, but to the deeper legacy she was leaving behind. A vision of a world where different cultures could blend and flourish together, where wisdom was valued above conquest, where love could triumph over political necessity. This was not merely a crown, but one of profound peace. Cleopatra would have appeared to be sleeping, her face serene and beautiful, as if she had simply chosen to step across the threshold between the world of the living and the realm of the eternal. The asp, if indeed it was an asp that carried her away, would have been found coiled peacefully nearby, its mission completed with divine precision, but a religious object that connected her to the protective power of the cobra goddess Wadjet, an unwavering commitment to the welfare of her people. Cleopatra had chosen her own destiny, even in death, transforming what might have been a defeat into a spiritual victory. She had become what she had always claimed to be, a goddess worthy of eternal reverence and worship. The uraeus had been worn by pharaohs for thousands of years, and its presence on Cleopatra's brow marked her as the legitimate heir to the divine throne of Egypt. Necklaces of gold and precious stones lay against her throat, the crook and flail that connected her to Osiris, the god of the underworld and rebirth. These objects had been crafted specifically for her burial, a death that would transform her into a goddess through its connection to the protective serpents of Egypt. The asp was sacred to the cobra goddess Wadjet, perhaps through a gentle poison that would allow her to slip away as quietly as the evening tide. Ancient Egyptian texts describe various substances that could provide a painless transition from life to death, and it is possible that Cleopatra chose one of these rather than the more dramatic asp bite described by Roman historians. And its bite was considered a form of divine transformation, rather than simple death. Their surfaces covered with gold and inlaid with precious stones, they were not mere ornaments, but sacred talismans that would guide and protect her in the afterlife. While bracelets encircled her wrists like bands of captured sunlight, on her brow would rest the golden uraeus. In her hands would be placed the traditional symbols of royal power. The traditional account tells us that Cleopatra chose to end her earthly existence by allowing a venomous asp to bite her. But some scholars suggest that her passing may have been even more peaceful. Whatever the exact circumstances, the chamber where she lay would have been filled with soft, golden light from dozens of oil lamps. As her spirit prepared to depart, the servants who discovered her would have found not a scene of tragedy. It was, in its way, the perfect ending to a life that had been lived with passion, intelligence. In the hours that followed, the mausoleum would have been sealed according to ancient Egyptian custom. But somewhere, in a place known only to the gods and the shifting sands of time. Chapter 4, the final chapter now. Dear companions of this peaceful journey, we must turn our attention to the twilight of Cleopatra's remarkable life. And the Mediterranean world stood on the precipice of transformation. The forces of Octavian, who would soon become the Emperor Augustus, had triumphed over the combined armies of Cleopatra and Mark Antony. The dream of an Eastern empire, with Alexandria as its glittering capital, was fading like mist before the morning sun, creating an atmosphere of serene majesty. These loyal souls moved through the chambers with reverent quiet, precious resins that would accompany her on her journey to the realm of the gods. These fragrances had been burning for hours. The smoke rose in gentle spirals, filling the chamber with aromatic smoke that was believed to carry prayers to the divine realm, creating patterns in the air that seemed to dance with supernatural grace. Their soft footsteps, muffled by rich carpets, woven with patterns that told the story of her dynasty. They understood that they were participating in events that would be remembered for thousands of years, and they conducted themselves with the solemnity that such moments required. The ceiling was decorated with astronomical symbols that represented the journey of the soul through the heavens, while the floor was inlaid with geometric patterns that had sacred significance in Egyptian religious tradition. That fateful August day in the year 30 before the Common Era. Instead, let us focus on the dignity and grace with which Cleopatra faced her final hours. Picture her in her private chambers within the great mausoleum she had prepared for herself, carried out according to traditions that stretched back thousands of years to the very dawn of Egyptian civilization. Every action had symbolic meaning. Every object had been chosen for its spiritual significance. This was not simply the end of a life, but a transformation from mortal queen to divine goddess, a structure that was itself a work of art, designed to serve as her final earthly palace. When the last pharaoh of Egypt prepared to join the eternal company of her ancestors, the date was August 30th, while columns of red granite provided support for roof sections that had been covered with sheets of gold. But let us not dwell on the violence and chaos of that distant day. This mausoleum had been under construction for several years, built according to plans that Cleopatra had personally supervised. White marble from distant quarries formed the basic structure, each designed for specific purposes in the complex rituals of royal burial. The central chamber, where Cleopatra would eventually be laid to rest, was a perfect square oriented to the cardinal directions. The walls were decorated with scenes from the Egyptian Book of the Dead, that death is simply another kingdom that must be entered with proper preparation and ceremony, painted in colors that seemed to glow with their own inner light. The entrance was guarded by sphinxes carved from black basalt, their faces combining human wisdom with animal strength in the traditional Egyptian manner. She understood, with the wisdom that comes to those who rule empires. The mausoleum was therefore not a grim tomb, but rather a beautiful temple palace where she could conduct the sacred rituals that would prepare her soul for its journey to the afterlife. The building itself was constructed of the finest materials available to the Ptolemaic kingdom. The interior of the mausoleum was divided into several chambers. Gold leaf caught and reflected the soft illumination of oil lamps. As she prepared for her final act, Cleopatra would have been surrounded by her most trusted servants and advisors. The air was heavy with the sweet scent of myrrh and frankincense. The process of preparation was itself a sacred ritual. Chapter 5. The Great Search begins. And so begins one of history's most enduring mysteries. The search for the final resting place of Egypt's last pharaoh. For over 2,000 years, scholars, adventurers, and dreamers have sought to uncover the location where Cleopatra's earthly remains were laid to rest. Each generation bringing its own hopes and theories to this eternal quest. Let us drift gently through the centuries, following the countless souls who have been drawn to this mystery like moths to a flickering flame. Each generation has brought its own dreams and theories to the search, creating a tapestry of human curiosity that spans millennia. In the years immediately following Cleopatra's death, the Romans themselves searched for her tomb. The Emperor Augustus, despite his victory over the Egyptian queen, held a deep respect for her intelligence and dignity. He understood that he had defeated not just a political rival, but one of the most remarkable rulers of the ancient world. Picture Augustus walking through the streets of Alexandria in those first months after his conquest, his purple-bordered toga rippling in the Mediterranean breeze. Despite being the most powerful man in the world, he moved with something approaching reverence through the city that Cleopatra had loved. Roman historians tell us that he ordered her mausoleum to be treated with respect, understanding that he had inherited not just a kingdom, but a sacred trust. The early Roman searches were conducted with systematic precision. Teams of soldiers and administrators combed through the records of the Ptolemaic court, interviewing servants and officials who might have knowledge of the tomb's location. They examined the architectural plans of various temples and mausoleums, looking for clues that might point to Cleopatra's final resting place. But even these early searches met with frustration. The political chaos that had surrounded Cleopatra's final years had led to the destruction of many records, and those who knew the tomb's exact location had either died in the fighting or had chosen to take the secret with them to their own graves. Within a generation of her death, the location of Cleopatra's tomb had become a mystery, even to those who ruled in her former capital. As the centuries passed and the Roman Empire itself began to fade, the location of Cleopatra's tomb gradually slipped from memory into legend. The great city of Alexandria, shaken by earthquakes and reshaped by the relentless passage of time, slowly transformed. Ancient buildings crumbled or were dismantled to provide stone for new construction. Some districts sank beneath the Mediterranean waves, taking their secrets with them to the ocean floor. The Great Library of Alexandria, that repository of ancient wisdom where Cleopatra had spent so many hours in study and contemplation, was gradually abandoned as political conditions became less stable. Scholars scattered to other centers of learning, taking with them whatever manuscripts they could carry. Many records that might have contained clues to the tomb's location were lost during this period of upheaval. But the dream of finding Cleopatra's tomb did not die with the decline of the classical world. During the medieval period, Arab scholars and historians took up the quest with the same passion that had driven their predecessors. These patient researchers pored over ancient texts in the great libraries of Cairo and Baghdad, searching for clues that might point the way to the lost tomb. Picture these medieval scholars working by lamplight in scriptoriums attached to mosques and madrasas, their reed pens moving carefully across parchment as they copied and translated ancient Greek and Latin texts. They approached the mystery with the same reverence they brought to their studies of astronomy and mathematics, understanding that the search itself was as valuable as any treasure they might discover. The medieval Arabic historians brought a different perspective to the search. They were less interested in the political aspects of Cleopatra's story and more focused on her reputation as a scholar and seeker of wisdom. Arabic texts from this period describe her as a philosopher queen who had mastered not just the arts of government, but also the deeper mysteries of existence. These scholars developed theories about the tomb's location based on their understanding of ancient Egyptian religious practices. They suggested that Cleopatra, having identified herself so closely with the goddess Isis, would have chosen a burial site that reflected this divine connection. This led them to focus their attention on temples dedicated to Isis throughout Egypt, particularly those in the Alexandria region. The Renaissance brought a new wave of interest in classical antiquity, and with it, renewed efforts to locate Cleopatra's final resting place. Italian scholars, inspired by the rediscovery of ancient texts, began to approach the mystery with more systematic methods. They compared different historical accounts, mapped the ancient topography of Alexandria, and developed theories based on careful analysis rather than mere speculation. These Renaissance researchers moved through the ruins of ancient Alexandria with something approaching reverence, understanding that they were walking through the remnants of one of history's greatest civilizations. They would spend hours examining fragments of carved stone, hoping to find inscriptions that might provide clues to the tomb's location. One of the most systematic of these early modern searches was conducted by the Venetian scholar Giovanni Belzoni in the early 19th century. Belzoni had originally trained as an engineer, and he brought a technical precision to archaeological work that was unusual for his time. He developed new methods for excavating ancient sites without damaging the structures beneath, and his careful documentation of his findings provided a model for future researchers. Picture Belzoni working in the blazing Egyptian sun, his European clothing adapted to the desert conditions, with wide-brimmed hats and loose-fitting robes. He would spend weeks at individual sites, carefully mapping the underground chambers and passages that he discovered. His journals, written by lamplight in his tent after long days of excavation, provide vivid descriptions of the experience of rediscovering ancient Egypt. The 18th and 19th centuries brought the era of European archaeological expeditions to Egypt. These were often grand affairs, with teams of scholars, artists, and workmen descending upon ancient sites with an enthusiasm that sometimes exceeded their scientific rigor. Yet even these larger expeditions approached the search for Cleopatra's tomb with a sense of wonder and respect. Picture Napoleon's scholars during his Egyptian campaign, working by torchlight in recently discovered chambers, carefully sketching hieroglyphic inscriptions that might contain clues to the Queen's final resting place. The expedition had brought not just soldiers, but also a team of over 160 scholars and scientists who were tasked with documenting every aspect of ancient Egyptian civilization. These Napoleonic scholars worked under difficult conditions, often in extreme heat and surrounded by the noise and confusion of military campaigns. Yet they maintained their dedication, to scholarly precision, creating detailed drawings and descriptions that would be studied by researchers for generations to come. Their multi-volume Description de l'Égypte became one of the foundational works of modern Egyptology. Or imagine Victorian archaeologists, dressed in their formal expedition attire despite the blazing desert heat, patiently sifting through ancient debris in search of clues. These researchers brought the methodical approach of 19th century science to their work, creating detailed catalogs of their findings and developing new techniques for preserving and analyzing ancient artifacts. The Victorian era also saw the development of new technologies that aided in the search. Photography allowed researchers to document their findings with unprecedented accuracy, creating permanent records that could be studied by scholars who were unable to visit the sites themselves. The systematic study of hieroglyphics, pioneered by Jean-François Champollion's decipherment of the Rosetta Stone, opened new avenues of investigation as scholars learned to read the ancient texts that might contain vital clues. Each generation brought new technologies and methodologies to the search. The development of more sophisticated surveying equipment allowed archaeologists to map ancient sites with greater precision. Chemical analysis of artifacts provided new information about ancient manufacturing techniques and trade relationships. Comparative studies of burial practices across different periods of Egyptian history helped researchers understand how royal tombs were typically constructed and located. By the 20th century, the search for Cleopatra's tomb had become one of archaeology's most prestigious quests. Respected institutions funded expeditions, and the most prominent archaeologists of their day devoted years to the pursuit. The Egyptian government began to take a more active role in managing archaeological work, ensuring that discoveries would remain in Egypt and contribute to the country's understanding of its own heritage. Yet, despite advances in technology and methodology, the tomb remained elusive, its location protected by the very passage of time that had made its discovery so urgently desired. Each new expedition would uncover fascinating artifacts and provide new insights into ancient Egyptian civilization. But the ultimate prize, the final resting place of Cleopatra herself, continued to elude even the most dedicated researchers. Throughout all these centuries of searching, there has been something almost mystical about the quest for Cleopatra's tomb. Researchers have often reported strange coincidences and unexpected discoveries, as if the ancient queen herself were somehow guiding their efforts. Weather patterns would shift unexpectedly, revealing previously hidden architectural features. Important discoveries would coincide with significant astronomical events, as if the cosmos itself were aligned with the search. Many of the most dedicated researchers have described their work not as a job or even a passion, but as a calling. They speak of dreams and visions that seem to guide their efforts, of intuitive insights that lead them to important discoveries. Whether one believes in such things or not, there is no denying that the search for Cleopatra's tomb has taken on dimensions that transcend mere archaeological investigation. Chapter 6: Modern Archaeological Dreams. As we continue our gentle journey through time, we arrive at the dawn of the 21st century, when new hope emerged for solving the ancient mystery of Cleopatra's tomb. This chapter of our story begins with two remarkable individuals whose dedication and vision would bring the world closer than ever to uncovering the truth. The first of these modern seekers was Dr. Zahi Hawass, Egypt's former Minister of Antiquities, a man whose passion for his country's ancient heritage had already led to countless discoveries. Dr. Hawass brought to the search not only his extensive knowledge of Egyptian archaeology, but also an intuitive understanding of how the ancient pharaohs thought about death and the afterlife. Picture Dr. Hawass in the early morning hours, standing at the edge of the Egyptian desert as the first rays of sunlight paint the sand in shades of gold and amber. His eyes scan the horizon, not just seeing the landscape as it appears today, but envisioning how it might have looked in Cleopatra's time, when the ancient roads and temples were still intact. Dr. Hawass had spent decades working at some of Egypt's most important archaeological sites. He had explored the hidden chambers of the Great Pyramid, uncovered the tombs of pyramid builders at Giza, and discovered the Valley of the Golden Mummies in the Bahariya Oasis. Each of these experiences had taught him something about how the ancient Egyptians approached death and burial, knowledge that would prove invaluable in the search for Cleopatra's tomb. When Dr. Hawass considered the question of where Cleopatra might be buried, he brought to bear not just academic knowledge, but also a lifetime of experience in reading the subtle signs that ancient sites leave in the landscape. He understood that royal tombs were never placed randomly, but were always positioned according to religious and astronomical considerations that reflected the deceased's journey to the afterlife. The second figure in this modern chapter of the search was Dr. Kathleen Martinez, a Dominican lawyer who had become a self-taught archaeologist through her deep passion for Cleopatra. Martinez's journey to Egypt began not in a university classroom, but in her own private study, where she spent countless hours poring over ancient texts and historical accounts. Imagine Martinez in her home in the Dominican Republic, surrounded by books and papers, working deep into the night as she traced connections between different historical sources. Her legal training had taught her to analyze evidence with meticulous care, and she brought this same analytical approach to the study of ancient history. She understood that solving the mystery of Cleopatra's tomb would require the same methodical examination of evidence that she used in preparing legal cases. Martinez's fascination with Cleopatra had begun during her university studies, but it had deepened over the years as she learned more about the complexity and intelligence of the ancient queen. She was struck by the fact that most popular accounts of Cleopatra focused on her romantic relationships with Julius Caesar and Mark Antony, while ignoring her remarkable achievements as a ruler and scholar. As Martinez delved deeper into the historical sources, she began to develop her own theories about where Cleopatra might be buried. She noticed that previous researchers had focused their attention primarily on Alexandria itself, assuming that the queen would have been buried in or near her capital city. But Martinez began to wonder whether this assumption might be incorrect. Martinez's theory was revolutionary, yet elegantly simple. While most scholars believed that Cleopatra was buried somewhere within the ancient city of Alexandria itself, Martinez proposed that the queen's final resting place was actually at Taposiris Magna, a temple complex located about 30 miles west of Alexandria. This theory was rooted in Martinez's detailed analysis of historical accounts by ancient writers such as Plutarch and Cassius Dio. These classical historians had suggested that Cleopatra might have been buried in a temple dedicated to Isis, the Egyptian goddess with whom the queen had closely identified herself throughout her reign. The more Martinez studied the ancient sources, the more convinced she became that Taposiris Magna fit the description of Cleopatra's burial site. The temple complex was dedicated to Isis and Osiris, the divine couple who ruled over death and rebirth in Egyptian mythology. For a queen who had presented herself as the living embodiment of Isis, such a location would have been perfectly appropriate. Picture Martinez presenting her theory to Egyptian authorities, her voice steady and confident as she outlined the evidence that had led her to this conclusion. She spoke not with the arrogance of someone seeking fame, but with the quiet conviction of a scholar who had spent years following a trail of clues that others had overlooked. Martinez had to overcome significant skepticism from the established archaeological community. Many experts questioned whether a lawyer with no formal archaeological training could contribute meaningfully to such an important quest. But Martinez's thoroughness in researching the historical sources and her logical approach to analyzing the evidence gradually won respect from even her harshest critics. In 2005, Martinez obtained the necessary permissions to begin excavations at Taposiris Magna. The process of securing these permissions had taken several years and required her to demonstrate not only her serious commitment to the project, but also her understanding of proper archaeological methods and her respect for Egypt's cultural heritage. The site presented significant challenges from the very beginning. Taposiris Magna was located on the edge of the Libyan desert, where the unstable structures and complex layers of archaeological deposits made excavation work both difficult and dangerous. The temple complex had been built over many centuries, with each generation of rulers adding new structures and modifying existing ones. But Martinez and her growing team of international collaborators approached these challenges with the patience and reverence that true archaeological work requires. Picture them in the early morning hours, when the desert air is still cool and clear, carefully setting up their equipment and planning each day's work with the precision of surgeons preparing for a delicate operation. The excavation process itself was meditative in its careful attention to detail. Each layer of earth was removed with small tools, brushes, trowels, and dental picks, while every fragment of pottery, every piece of carved stone, every ancient coin was carefully catalogued and photographed before being removed from its resting place. The team worked in squares that were precisely measured and mapped, ensuring that the exact location of each discovery would be permanently recorded. This meticulous approach meant that progress was often frustratingly slow, but it also meant that no important information would be lost through hasty excavation. Over the course of several years, the team began to uncover artifacts that supported Martinez's theory. Coins bearing Cleopatra's likeness emerged from the sand, their surfaces still showing the proud profile of the last pharaoh. These coins were particularly significant because they had been found in contexts that suggested they had been deliberately placed as offerings rather than simply lost during daily activities. Statues and inscriptions were discovered that connected the site to Cleopatra's reign, each discovery adding another piece to the vast puzzle. Some of these statues depicted Cleopatra herself, while others showed her in the company of various Egyptian gods and goddesses. The inscriptions, written in both Greek and Egyptian hieroglyphs, spoke of royal ceremonies and religious rituals that had taken place at the temple. But perhaps the most intriguing aspect of the excavation was the series of unusual events that seemed to guide the archaeologists' efforts. Team members reported that their most significant discoveries often coincided with unexpected weather events, sudden sandstorms that would clear to reveal previously hidden architectural features, or unexpected rains that would wash away debris and expose important artifacts. Some members of the excavation team reported vivid dreams that seemed to provide guidance for their work. These dreams often featured images of ancient rituals or visions of chambers hidden beneath the sand. While such experiences cannot be scientifically validated, they added an element of mystery to the excavation that reminded everyone involved that they were working at the intersection of the known and the unknowable. Dr. Hawass himself visited the site multiple times, bringing his expertise to bear on the interpretation of the discoveries. He was particularly interested in the astronomical alignments of the various structures, understanding that ancient Egyptian architects always oriented their buildings according to celestial patterns that had religious significance. The most significant discovery came with the unearthing of a large, unfinished tunnel beneath the temple complex. This tunnel, carved with remarkable precision and craftsmanship, led to a series of chambers that appeared to have been designed for someone of extraordinary importance. Picture the moment when the archaeologists first broke through into this hidden tunnel system. The beam of their flashlights would have cut through darkness that had remained undisturbed for over 2,000 years, illuminating stone walls carved with the same skill that had created the great temples of ancient Egypt. The tunnel itself was approximately 6 feet high and 4 feet wide, large enough for people to walk through comfortably, but small enough to be easily concealed. The walls were smooth and showed evidence of careful planning and execution. Tool marks on the stone indicated that the work had been done by master craftsmen who understood the properties of the local limestone and knew how to work with it efficiently. The tunnel system revealed evidence of sophisticated engineering and architectural planning. The chambers were connected by passages that had been carefully designed to channel air and provide drainage, suggesting that the complex had been intended for long-term use. The precision of the stonework indicated that this was not a hastily constructed hiding place, but a carefully planned mausoleum worthy of royal occupancy. Within these chambers, the team discovered a hidden room containing a collection of golden artifacts and inscriptions that made specific reference to a Queen of Kings, a title that had been closely associated with Cleopatra throughout her reign. These artifacts were not randomly distributed, but had been carefully placed according to ancient Egyptian burial customs. The golden artifacts included jewelry, ceremonial objects, and religious symbols that would have been appropriate for a royal burial. Many of these objects were inscribed with hieroglyphs that invoked the protection of various gods and goddesses, particularly Isis and Osiris. The craftsmanship was of the highest quality, indicating that these objects had been created specifically for someone of the highest social and religious status. The discovery generated enormous excitement throughout the archaeological community and captured the imagination of people around the world. Press conferences were held to announce the findings, and documentaries were produced to share the story of the excavation with a global audience. But even as the world celebrated these remarkable discoveries, Martinez and her team remained focused on the painstaking work of excavation and analysis. They understood that they had uncovered something significant, but they also knew that much more work would be needed to fully understand the implications of their findings. The artifacts discovered at Osiris Magna were subjected to the most advanced analytical techniques available to modern archaeology. Radiocarbon dating was used to establish the age of organic materials, while chemical analysis provided information about the sources of metals and stones. Advanced imaging techniques revealed details that were invisible to the naked eye, including traces of ancient pigments and inscriptions that had been worn away by time. Chapter 7: Theories and Whispered Possibilities. As our peaceful journey through time draws toward its gentle conclusion, let us explore the various theories about where Cleopatra's earthly remains might rest. Each possibility represents a different vision of how the last pharaoh chose to spend eternity, and each carries its own poetry and mystery. The traditional theory places Cleopatra's tomb somewhere within the ancient city of Alexandria itself. This seems logical, as Alexandria was not only the capital of her kingdom, but also the city she loved most dearly. Picture her tomb, hidden beneath the modern city, perhaps in a chamber that lies below the bustling streets where vendors sell their wares and children play in courtyards. If this theory is correct, then Cleopatra rests beneath layers of history. Roman ruins built atop Ptolemaic foundations, medieval Islamic architecture rising above ancient Greek columns, and modern buildings constructed over the accumulated debris of centuries. Her tomb would be like a pearl at the heart of an oyster, protected by the very urban development that has made its discovery so challenging. The Alexandria theory suggests that Cleopatra's mausoleum lies somewhere in the royal quarter of the ancient city, perhaps near the palace complex where she spent her final years. Archaeological evidence indicates that this area was heavily developed during the Ptolemaic period, with elaborate buildings and underground chambers that could easily conceal a royal tomb. Some researchers have focused their attention on the area near the ancient Serapeum, the great temple dedicated to the Greco-Egyptian god Serapis. This temple was one of the most important religious sites in Alexandria during Cleopatra's time, and it would have been an appropriate location for the burial of a queen who had identified herself with the Egyptian gods. Other scholars believe that her tomb might lie beneath the Mediterranean waves, in that portion of ancient Alexandria that was claimed by earthquake and subsidence. In this vision, Cleopatra sleeps in an underwater palace, her sarcophagus surrounded by fish that swim through chambers where once her courtiers walked. This aquatic theory has a particular romance to it. Marine archaeologists working in Alexandria's harbor have discovered remarkable structures beneath the waves, columns and statues that once graced the ancient city. The palace quarter of ancient Alexandria extended into what is now the harbor, and it's entirely possible that Cleopatra's mausoleum was located in an area that later subsided into the sea. Picture Cleopatra's underwater tomb as a place of eternal tranquility, where the gentle movement of the tide provides eternal music for her rest. Shafts of sunlight, filtering down through the water, would create patterns of dancing light on the walls of her tomb, while schools of colorful fish would serve as her eternal guardians. The underwater theory is supported by geological evidence that shows significant changes in the Alexandria coastline over the past 2,000 years. Earthquakes in the 4th and 8th centuries CE caused substantial portions of the ancient city to sink below sea level, taking with them countless artifacts and possibly even royal tombs. But the theory that has gained the most support in recent years is Martinez's proposal that Cleopatra lies at Taposiris Magna, the temple complex dedicated to Isis. This theory suggests that Cleopatra chose to be buried not in a traditional pharaonic tomb, but in a sacred space that reflected her deep identification with the goddess Isis. Imagine Cleopatra's tomb at Taposiris Magna as a hidden sanctuary, where ancient rituals are still performed by the wind and sand. The desert around the temple would serve as a natural guardian, its shifting dunes concealing and revealing the ancient structures according to patterns known only to time itself. The Taposiris Magna theory is based on several lines of evidence. The temple was dedicated to Isis and Osiris, the divine couple who ruled over death and rebirth in Egyptian mythology. For a queen who had presented herself as the living embodiment of Isis, such a location would have been theologically perfect. Additionally, ancient sources suggest that Cleopatra and Mark Antony were buried together, and Taposiris Magna would have provided enough space for a double burial of the appropriate magnificence. The temple complex covers a large area and includes numerous underground chambers that could have served as royal tombs. Some researchers have proposed that Cleopatra's tomb might be located in the western desert, far from Alexandria and the political turmoil that marked her final years. This theory suggests that she chose a remote location where her rest would be undisturbed by the conflicts of the living world. Picture such a desert tomb, a hidden valley where the silence is broken only by the whisper of wind through ancient stone. Here, surrounded by the eternal stars that the ancient Egyptians believed were the souls of the blessed dead, Cleopatra would rest in perfect peace, her tomb oriented to catch the first rays of the rising sun. The desert theory is based on the precedent set by other royal figures who chose remote burial locations during times of political instability. Some pharaohs of the New Kingdom were buried in hidden tombs in the Valley of the Kings, specifically to protect their remains from tomb robbers and political enemies. Another intriguing possibility is that Cleopatra's tomb lies not in Egypt at all, but in some distant location where she might have sent her most precious possessions for safekeeping during the turbulent final years of her reign. Some historians have suggested that she might have established a secret burial site in a friendly kingdom, far from the reach of Roman armies. This theory imagines Cleopatra's final resting place as being in a location chosen not for its traditional significance, but for its security and remoteness. Perhaps in the mountains of Nubia, where Egyptian queens had maintained summer palaces, or in an oasis deep in the desert, where loyal followers could maintain her tomb in perpetuity without interference from changing political powers. Each of these theories reflects a different aspect of Cleopatra's complex character. The Alexandria theory emphasizes her love for her capital city and her desire to remain close to the center of learning and culture. The underwater theory speaks to the romantic and mysterious aspects of her legend. The Taposiris Magna theory reflects her deep spiritual connection to the goddess Isis. The desert theory suggests her desire for peace and solitude after a lifetime of political struggle. What makes the mystery even more intriguing is that multiple burial sites might exist. It was not uncommon for pharaohs to maintain several tombs, and Cleopatra, facing the uncertainty of her final years, might well have prepared multiple resting places. Perhaps her body lies in one location, while her most precious possessions were distributed among several hidden chambers. There is also the possibility that Cleopatra's tomb was discovered long ago but not recognized for what it was. Ancient burials were often disturbed by treasure hunters, and it's possible that her remains were moved, or that identifying inscriptions were damaged or destroyed. In this scenario, Cleopatra might rest in a museum collection, her identity unknown to the scholars who study her artifacts. The most romantic theory of all suggests that Cleopatra's tomb exists in a place that transcends physical location, that her choice to identify herself so completely with the goddess Isis means that she achieved the divine transformation she sought, and now rests not in any earthly tomb, but in the realm of the gods themselves. Whether any of these theories proves correct, the search for Cleopatra's tomb represents something more than archaeological investigation. It represents humanity's eternal desire to connect with the great figures of the past, to understand how they lived and how they chose to face eternity. Closing meditation. And so, dear companions of this peaceful journey, we come to the end of our exploration through the mystery of Cleopatra's lost tomb. As the gentle darkness of sleep beckons, let us reflect on what we have discovered together in these quiet hours. Perhaps the greatest treasure in this ancient mystery is not gold or jewels, but the reminder that some questions are more beautiful than their answers. For over 2,000 years, the unknown location of Cleopatra's tomb has inspired countless souls to seek, to dream, to imagine what might lie hidden beneath the shifting sands of time. In a world that sometimes seems to value certainty above all else, Cleopatra's missing tomb reminds us that mystery itself has value. The search for her final resting place has led to countless other discoveries, has inspired new generations of archaeologists and historians, and has kept alive the memory of one of history's most remarkable rulers. Whether she rests beneath the Mediterranean waves, in the hidden chambers of Taposiris Magna, in the silence of the western desert, or in some location yet undreamed by modern searchers, Cleopatra has achieved a form of immortality that even she might not have imagined. Her story continues to unfold with each new discovery, each new theory, each new dreamer who takes up the quest. As you drift toward sleep, perhaps you too will dream of ancient chambers filled with golden light, of tunnels carved with loving precision, of a queen who chose to identify herself with the eternal goddess Isis. Perhaps in your dreams, you will walk through the royal gardens of Alexandria, hear the gentle lapping of Mediterranean waves, or feel the soft desert wind that has blown over Egypt for millennia. The mystery of Cleopatra's tomb reminds us that the most important journeys are not always those that reach their destination, but those that transform the travelers along the way. Each person who has sought her tomb has been changed by the search, has connected with something larger than themselves, has touched the eternal human desire to transcend the limitations of mortal existence. And so Cleopatra rests, somewhere in the embrace of the land she loved, watched over by the gods she served, surrounded by the mysteries she cherished. Whether she sleeps in hidden chambers or has transcended the need for any earthly tomb, she has found the ultimate peace that follows a life lived with passion, intelligence, and unwavering dedication to something greater than oneself. Rest well, dear travelers. Let the gentle mysteries of the ancient world carry you into peaceful dreams, knowing that somewhere in the shifting sands of Egypt, the last pharaoh sleeps in eternal dignity, her secret safe in the embrace of time itself. The search continues, but for now, let us rest. And so, dear dreamer, as the echoes of history fade and the quiet of the night settles in, may your mind find peace, and your dreams take you to places even time cannot touch. Until next time, sleep well and dream deeply.